We need someone who has the courage of his convictions, who has the ability to fight for the needs of this city and the needs of the middle class as well as the oppressed in this community. There's a group of people in Congress who would like to take away what many of us have gained over the past few years and who would like to reduce the middle class to poverty while shifting our money to a small but increasingly wealthy plutocracy. These people would also like to create a theocracy in this country which would impose a scarlet letter of shame upon all of us who differ from their so-called traditional values. So they advocate plutocracy, theocracy, but never democracy. But our Speaker is not going to let them do it. When push comes to shove, he is a fighter. When courage is needed, he finds it. And when some people say the Democratic Party has no core of political values, I think that his very existence denies this idea. So who is it that protects all of us in Minnesota and in the United States against those people who have been newly installed in the U.S. House and Senate and who are bent on destroying our Minnesota tradition of progressive government? My friends, it is a person whom I have known and respected for many years. It is Senator Paul Wellstone.
Warren and Wally and everyone here today at the First Unitarian Society, Minneapolis. Let me start out by saying the least important thing that I'm going to say today, and then I'll go to more important. I want to say to my friends over there with the video from the Republican Party that I understand what the politics of distortion is about. And I also understand that I am the most targeted Democrat in the nation. Alfonso D'Amato, Jesse Helms, and all the rest. But I can assure you that it is a huge privilege, and I intend to triumph over this kind of politics. It is a huge honor to be invited to speak at this lecture series. And I hope that what I have to say will be of value to all of you. And maybe even more importantly, I hope that what I have to say will truly honor the memory of Chris Curry. I was a teacher for many years. And long before I ever thought I would run for the United States Senate, I found myself, though I was a college teacher, traveling to high schools. And I used to say this to Sheila all the time. I would say to the students, politics does not have to be about money and power games. Politics is about the improvement of people's lives. It's about lessening human suffering, and it's about advancing the cause of peace and justice in our country and in our world. Chris Curry, a remarkable young man, lived those words, and he lit a candle for all of us. The topic you asked me to speak about, is there a future for political liberalism in the United States, is a topic that I'm interested in addressing, with one caveat, which is in many ways I reject a lot of the labels because ultimately I don't think politics is so much about left or right or center, but more about connecting to people's lives and speaking to the concerns and circumstances of people's lives. I remember recently I was in a debate in McNeil-Lehrer, and of course the question was, should the Democratic Party adopt the DLC position, Democratic Leadership Conference position, or be more liberal? And I said, you know, I was just at the Town Talk Cafe in Wilmer, and nobody asked me whether I was a member of the DLC. In fact, people don't know what it is. And rarely do people come up and say, are you left, or are you right, or you're center? People do yearn for good representation. But I would like to talk about the question of liberalism because it is a philosophy that I am very proud of, and I'd like to talk about liberalism both with a sense of history and with a sense of definition. First, history. It was the liberals, it was liberalism, the philosophy that informed the abolitionist movement. We were not on the side of the slave owners, we were on the side of the slaves. It was liberalism that informed the women suffragettes and that struggle for equality and for voting rights. We were on the side of expanding America and expanding democracy. It was liberalism and liberals that were on the side of the Farmers Alliance in the late 1890s and the progressive movement out of the Midwest in the early 1900s with the focus on the concentration of power and insisting that government be more open and accountable and honest. And it was liberals who were on the side of labor, the right to organize, the right to form a union, the right to bargain collectively. And it were liberals who were on the side of Social Security. And please remember, as we discuss Social Security, that before Social Security, 1935, then implemented in the early 1940s, it used to be in our country that if you looked at who were the poor, disproportionately they were the elderly. An extremely important program in dramatically reducing poverty among elderly citizens within our country. And it was the philosophy of liberalism that informed the civil rights movement, which was a movement that confronted apartheid in the South in our country, which was a movement for civil rights and then human rights. And it was liberalism that informed the environmental movement for more protection against the ravishing of our air and our land and our water. And it's liberalism that has insisted on the dignity of the person, on human rights. That is a very proud tradition. Definition. I think that there is a single set of values that undergird this philosophy. And if I had to summarize what this philosophy is about, it is a simple, almost irrefutable, irreducible aspiration for a community Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used to call a beloved community. The aspiration for a community where each and every citizen will have the opportunity to be all she can be or all he can be. Equality of opportunity. Call it, if you will, the American dream. I'm a little older now, a father and a grandfather, and I have a way of defining liberalism, or at least the core set of values that inform me as a United States Senator. And it goes like this. And it's very simple, and it really is the aspiration for such a community. 2 grandchildren. Kari, who's going to be 4 in a few weeks. Keith, who's about 8 months. I forgot what it was like, because our children are all in their 20s. But when I was there at the birth of each of those children, each of those grandchildren, I thought to myself, I know what I believe in. I know what the core set of values is. I know what this aspiration is. I know what liberal philosophy is. And it is as follows. I want to live in a country, really I want to live in a world, where each and every child, when I look at infants that are newly born, I can say to myself, regardless of whether that infant is black or Native American or Hispanic or Southeast Asian or white, regardless of that infant comes from a low income or high income or rural or metropolitan background, I want to know that that infant will have a chance to be all that she can be or all that he can be. That is the American dream. That is our philosophy. What is the operational definition of that philosophy? I think it's simple. First of all, it's early childhood development. It's support for the Women, Infant, and Children program. It's support for Head Start. I watch our grandchildren when we go to visit David and Tammy. I can't believe it. Every 15 seconds, they're interested in something new. I'm not. They are. Every 15 seconds. It's as if they experience the world with all of its unnamed magic before them. And we believe that there ought to be support for children when they're young. What is the operational indicator of that? Strong support for public education. I was a college professor at Carleton College. One of my best friends, Norm Vig, is here with me, political scientist. And I could see, teaching at Carleton, how a child from any kind of background, if that spark of learning is ignited, how that child from any background could come to a life of creativity and accomplishment. The worst thing we can do in our country is to pour cold water on that spark. And the best thing we can do is to ignite that spark. What is this philosophy? Making sure that higher education is affordable for young people, for our students, who, by the way, are no longer necessarily 18 and 19 and living in a dorm, many of them older, many of them single parents, many of them women with small children, or making sure that if young people don't go on to higher education, they're able to make a transition to jobs. What is liberalism? Jobs, Paul Scott. Jobs that people can count on. Jobs with decent wages and decent working conditions. We are not interested in locking people up. We are interested in lifting people up, and we understand the essential truth of it all, which is that we send our young people the wrong message when we invest $30,000 and $40,000 and $50,000 a year to imprison them, but we don't spend $8,000 a year when they're young to make sure that they have a chance. And no matter how many prisons we build, and we certainly know there are some people who should be in prison forever, but no matter how many prisons we build, we understand the essential truth of it. We'll never stop the cycle of violence unless, Sheila, we stop the violence at home, and unless we invest in the health and the skills and the intellect and the character of young people in the United States of America. That is part of what we understand. It is with the sense of history that I now turn to this contract or con with America. It is an agenda which is too extreme. It's an agenda which is too harsh. And it is an agenda which goes beyond the goodness of people within our country. It's not about ketchup as a vegetable. That was the debate in the early 1980s. It goes way beyond that. And if I had to summarize what is at stake, I would make the following argument, which unfortunately I believe I can marshal a considerable amount of evidence for. This is no less than an effort to overturn 60 years of people's history. That is to say, many of us, many of our parents and many of our grandparents struggled. We gave our sweat and tears, and Sheila and I living in the South know we also gave our blood and our lives to make the United States of America a better country. We gained some protection against the terror of unemployment, some protection against strike breaking, some protection against the ravishing of our air and our land and our water, some protection at the workplace. We gained civil rights and human rights for people. All of that is what is in jeopardy today. This is an effort to turn the clock back big time, back to the 1920s. And the most extreme form of this effort we just saw the other day when you have representatives coming to the floor of the United States House of Representatives and comparing women and children with animals, all in the name of what they call welfare reform, which is punitive and degrading. They are not conservatives, they're bullies, and they should be defeated. This is about an effort to turn the clock back. It's about creating the Texification and the Mississippiation of the United States of America, and the goal is not for Minnesota to go down to Texas and Mississippi standards, but to lift Mississippi and Texas to Minnesota standards. And it is about abandoning our national responsibility, our national community, and our commitment for justice and fairness in America. Look at the attack on affirmative action. It is quite one thing to take a program and argue that there are imperfections with that program. There are imperfections with private sector and public sector programs. It is quite one thing to say that sometimes the application of affirmative action has meant reverse discrimination, hard and fast quotas, which all of us oppose. It is quite another thing to deliberately push race buttons and divide people further by race and gender and insist that there's no such thing as discrimination in America. Leadership is not appealing to the fears and frustrations of people. Leadership is calling on people to be their own best selves, and that's the politics we intend to win on in Minnesota. But then what was the meaning of the election in 1994? What did it mean? Because I'm about to tell you that this isn't just my own analysis. You can look at the polling data. There's a tremendous amount of goodness in people. People are not in favor of abandoning children. People don't want to devalue the work of adults that work with children. People don't want to cut nutrition programs for children. People are not in favor of the degradation of the environment. And people in the United States of America and people in Minnesota believe in equality of opportunity. So what happened in 1994? Well, first of all, nationally, there was a 61% hole in the electorate. Only 39% of the people voted. Only 39% of the people voted. 112 million people stayed at home. And in Minnesota, only 53% of the people voted. And those people who did not vote spoke loudly. They don't see the connection to politics. And we have to reach out. And we have to do a much better job of connecting with people. Secondly, among those who did vote, I would say to Dee Long and others, because Dee has been such an experienced and I think really fine legislator, that there is anger in the country. We know that. People are in a downright anti-status quo mood. People are not hunkered down. Populism is in the air. People feel ripped off. People are angry. People want to see change. And I'm not so uncomfortable with that change orientation. But that always begged the question, what kind of change? And I will tell you right now, as people see this con with America and they see the extremism of it, they are really frightened by it and people are turning away from it, and that is, I think, very important. But I worry because denunciation is not enough. We have to have enunciation. I feel like in some ways I have to apply that standard to myself. Most of my time has been on the floor of the United States Senate, essentially confronting and taking on this agenda, trying to stop the worst parts of it. You know, when I was a political science teacher, I used to talk about the wisdom of the founders of this nation, and you know how the House moves one way, but the Senate is much more deliberate. Those guys had it right. They really did. I realize that now in a way that I didn't before. Wish there had been some women there as well, but they did have it right. But I don't think it's enough. I've come to the floor of the Senate 4 times with the following amendment. It is a sense of the Senate that we will not take any action that would create more hunger or homelessness among children in America. I've been defeated 4 times. First several times, others came out on the floor. Senator Dole did once, majority leader, and he said, Senator from Minnesota is just trying to embarrass us. He's just trying to pretend like we don't care about children. And I said, prove me wrong and vote for it. But the vote's going up each time. And now there are some Republicans who have come over, and now we're up to 48 votes. And I'll be back on the floor next week as we deal with these rescissions. Notice where the cuts were. And by the way, I'm extremely proud to say that whereas in the House of Representatives, they zeroed out the low-income energy assistance program. I come from a cold weather state, in case anybody didn't notice it. And then to be more serious, we have 110,000 households, over 300,000 people, and in those households, 30% elderly, 40% a child, over 50% with someone working. And those $300 to $350 grants are the difference between being able to stay in your home and not, between heat or eat. And I met with some very courageous citizens here in Minnesota who spoke for themselves and talked about how important it was. And what we essentially said was, if you want to go about the business of deficit reduction, you eliminate the subsidies for the oil companies. You don't cut into low-income energy systems. And you know what happened? And you know what happened? You know what happened? In the United States Senate on Friday, the Senate Appropriations Committee, chaired by Senator Hatfield, responding to some of us senators, restored that funding. Did you get that on your camera okay? They restored that funding. Be sure to play that in an ad. But denunciation is not just enough. And I think we have to talk about what it is we're for, not just what we're against. And I think we have to talk about this liberal philosophy in a different context, maybe a new liberalism. And I'd like to try and spell out some themes and some ideas that I hope will be helpful to you. First of all, let's be clear. National standards make a tremendous amount of sense. Part of the problem with this con with America is it is an effort to rip apart a national community. Of course we have national standards when it comes to civil rights and human rights and protection of the environment and equality of opportunity. But by the same token, I think the criticisms of many people in the country of overly centralized and overly bureaucratized public policy, that's a thoughtful critique. To try and get programs closer to people, to try and have more of the creativity and more of the delivery of programs and more people involved at the community level makes a great deal of sense. So let us accept, if you will, the importance of decentralization. But when we talk about decentralization, let me just remind you that Washington, D.C. is the only place I know where when the governors come, people say the grassroots is now speaking. If we're going to decentralize, get it down to the county and the city and the town and the neighborhood level. That's real decentralization. Revitalization of community and revitalization of democracy. I think the 3 E's really apply. Education, entrepreneurship, and empowerment. And I'll give you a rural application of this, since much of my work has been in greater Minnesota, but it certainly also applies to our metropolitan and our urban community. When I speak at some of the high schools in rural Minnesota, it is with a tremendous sense of sadness when I discover that the advice to many younger people is to get ahead, get an education. The application of that is to get ahead, get an education because there's nothing here for you. Just leave because this place is going nowhere. But that's not Adam Smith's invisible hand that's operative. There are all sorts of possibilities for entrepreneurship, for homegrown economies, for self-reliant communities, and for those younger people to go on and pursue their education and then come back in those communities and make something happen. So if we're going to talk about decentralization, and we're going to talk about expanding democracy, and we're going to talk about empowerment, all of that, by the way, is language that I dearly love, then let's take it seriously and apply it to economic decision-making, and let's ask the question, why do we rely on multinational corporations that make decisions halfway across the world over martinis that can make or break people's lives in our communities? Why don't we move toward more locally owned businesses, more local capital investment? Let's control some of our own capital and our own economic destiny in our communities in Minnesota. That, I think, should be very much a part of the new liberalism in the United States of America. And there are many exciting examples that I could give, but won't because of time. Next part of what I think should be part of our agenda and what this philosophy informs is government reform. Absolutely. Let me be very honest, brutally honest. I think it was a terrible mistake, and this is not Monday morning quarterbacking because I was very involved in this. President Clinton gave a marvelous inaugural address. It was clear blue sky, sunny day, and at least 50% of his speech, if you remember, was the theme of people gaining more control over their own government, of ethics and reform and campaign finance and gift ban and lobbying disclosure. I tell you that one of the worst things that happened is that Democratic leadership didn't think it was important. They thought it was just the goo-goos that were interested, the common cause people. But people want to see more accountability. They want to see some of this big money eliminated. They want to see campaign finance reform. They don't want to see senators and representatives having lobbyists and others pay for their trips to wherever. They want all of this changed. And I just want to tell you that for the better part of 4 years, I brought amendments and bills to the floor of the United States Senate. All of that legislation was filibustered or blocked. So now I run for office. No changes were made. Most targeted person in the country. And I have to raise funds to make sure that I'm not attacked day in and day out on television without some kind of response. But I also can assure you that after the recess in April, I look forward to coming to the floor of the United States Senate one more time with gift ban, lobbying disclosure, and other strong ethics issues, and I can't wait for the debate. Did you get that on camera? And finally, I think we have to pay attention to what people were saying. It is crystal clear that there are changes that should be made. No one in this room should be so arrogant as to not pay attention to what people are saying, even if we don't agree. And I'll tell you something else people were saying. They were saying, get your economic house in order. This is at the federal level. And I think they're right. Now, I voted against the balanced budget amendment, which politically was a difficult vote, and of course attack ads were run. But I voted against it because I did not see the real integrity of such a proposal. Nobody ever was willing to outline how they were going to take $1.8 trillion out of this economy over the next 6 years or 7 years without a real contraction and without inflicting widespread pain. And I had amendment after amendment about right to know, spell out where you're going to make these cuts. There was always silence. Those amendments were always defeated. But by the same time, while we had $500 billion in deficit reduction, and while the annual budget deficit is less a percentage of the GNP than it's been for decades, nevertheless, if you look at the projections, it is important that we address this deficit. It is important that we address this debt. The farmers in southeast Minnesota would put it well. You plant your seed corn. You don't eat your seed corn. And the interest on the debt robs us of our capacity to invest in ourselves. So I think deficit reduction has to be an important part of our philosophy. But let me be clear. 2002 is a political date. I raised the question in caucus over and over again, where did 2002 come from? And no one could answer it. I'm now being critical of some of the Democrats, not just Republicans. But in 2010, that's when most of us baby boomers will be 65 and eligible for Social Security. And there's no reason whatsoever that we cannot spell out how we have a steady glide path so that by 2010 we do balance that budget. But let me be clear, it's got to be economically rigorous. You've got to allow for some flexibility, because if you go into a recession, last thing you want to be doing is raising taxes and cutting spending, in which case the recession becomes a depression. You have to allow for responsible economic management, and there has to be some standard of fairness. And I can assure you that as I push for that plan, the focus won't be on cutting school lunch and school breakfast and nutrition programs at child care. The focus will be on $415 billion of loopholes and deductions and sometimes outright dodges, some of which are good for the economy, but some of which just amount to gigantic subsidies for oil companies, coal companies, tobacco companies, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies. If we're going to cut the deficit, and we should, let's insist on some standard of fairness and make sure that all parts of our society are a part of that sacrifice. And as long as we're going to be making those cuts, let's redefine national security. There is no reason why we continue to spend $260 or so billion on the Pentagon budget, some of it preparing for a war with the Soviet Union that no longer exists, with many wasteful weapon programs. We should always be for a strong national defense. But we should not let the military contractors escape from being a part of who's asked to tighten their belt. And we should redefine national security. And part of the redefinition of national security is not more B-2 bombers, not an additional $80 billion or so as listed in the con with America over 5 years, but rather some significant cuts so that national security becomes not just more bombs or missiles, but the security of our local communities, where there's adequate housing and affordable child care and small businesses developed and decent jobs and a commitment to education, so that the rural children learn about the beauty of African American or Native American or Southeast Asian or Hispanic poetry, and the children of the cities learn about the diversity, yes, the diversity of rural Minnesota, and where every boy, and even more importantly, every girl can grow up dreaming to be president of the United States of America. That's the real national security for our nation. Is there a future for political liberalism in the United States? In 1969, when I came to teach at Carleton, Ted Lowy, talented political scientist, wrote a book. You guessed the title of the book, The End of Liberalism in America. He was wrong then, and he's wrong now. Because, as I said at the beginning, there is an aspiration that is irrefutable and irreducible. And it is an aspiration for a community where there is true equality of opportunity for each and every citizen. As a first-generation American, son of a Jewish immigrant from Russia, I can tell you that that is, in fact, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the American dream. Expand America, be more inclusive, make sure there's fairness and justice. Of course that philosophy will continue to inform our nation. But remember the definition of empowerment. Empowerment is when all of us understand that what will happen in history is not independent of what we do. The political climate is not independent of what we do. So I didn't come here today at this distinguished lecture series to make predictions or to make observations. I would do that if I was teaching in a political science class. I came here today to first and foremost honor a remarkable young man, Christopher Curry. And I also came here to honor you because you take time out of your lives, away from loved ones, and you give some of that time to the betterment of community and to the betterment of the country. You work for what you believe in. And for that, I honor you. And since that is the way you live your lives, you know, and I know, that in the last analysis, politics and answering the question of whether there's a future for political liberalism is not observations or predictions. Politics is what we create by what we do, by what we hope for, and by what we dare to imagine. I thank you.
Our first question is, what is the future of Medicaid?
A, you've got an agenda. Let me be ecumenical. There is an old Yiddish proverb, I think. Mel Rosenblum is going to say, you're probably wrong, that says you can't dance at two weddings at the same time. Beware, if I can say this with a twinkle in my eye, beware of every breed of politician, whether he or she is Republican or Democrat, who says, I'm in favor of broad-based tax cuts for everyone, which, by the way, amounts to $700 billion over the next 10 years. I'm in favor of a stronger military. I'm going to pay the interest on the debt. We certainly have to do that as well. But I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid or veterans programs or education or children. The arithmetic just does not add up. So I think there will be a frontal attack on Medicare and Medicaid, and here's the problem. It makes sense to think about some reforms. Part B, Medicare, if you're talking about a household with an income over $100,000 a year and over, doesn't make sense to provide a subsidy. But by the way, one of the more vicious myths perpetuated in American politics is that with the elderly population, what you have is a bunch of, quote, greedy geezers that are all playing golf all over the United States of America. It's simply not true. The median income for a male is about $15,000 a year over 65, and for female, you guess, about $8,000 a year. So here's the point. You're not going to get a lot of money from means testing it at $100,000. I think that this is the fear. If you want to have overall health care reform, including cost containment, for example, if you want to have some cap on what insurance companies can charge by way of premiums, and you want to do some really good preventative health care and support our public institutions, fine. But if you don't have overall health care reform, and you just target Medicaid, and I would argue Medicare as well, then this is going to be the problem. The very people who, when we were talking about universal health care coverage, yelled and screamed about rationing, now when you talk about just going after Medicaid, and please remember, there's nothing wrong with Medicaid being used to support women and children, but probably about 40% of Medicaid expenditures in our state and around the country now support elderly who are in nursing homes. So now what we're talking about, if you just cut Medicaid and Medicare without any other changes in the healthcare system, is truly rationing in the country. Rationing by income, rationing by age, and rationing by disability. Too much of the cuts, have you noticed, have been based upon the path of least political resistance. That is to say, those citizens with the least amount of political clout. That's what's so unconscionable about it.
Next question. Would you comment on the wisdom of any tax cut in the face of the deficit problem?
It's interesting. It didn't really get so widely reported in Minnesota, and I kind of wish it had. When all of these proposals came out for broad-based tax cuts, I took a counterintuitive position and said that I was opposed to broad-based tax cuts. I have now maintained the same position for the better part of the last 3 or 4 months or whatever. I think it's simply impossible to talk about broad-based tax cuts. If you targeted some of these tax cuts, maybe, for example, capital gains, small business, locally owned. But broad-based tax cuts, again, these are not my projections. This is sort of independent analysis. You're talking about $200 billion over the first 5 years, and then you're talking about $500 billion that accelerates over the next 5 years. That $700 billion you then have to offset from cuts somewhere else. That's what's so unconscionable about this rescission cuts package that came out of the House of Representatives. So I think it is a huge mistake. And by the way, with the tax credit for children, I don't know where these senators and representatives get the idea that $200,000 is middle class, not in the state of Minnesota.
Next question. I continue to hear about the coming crisis in Social Security. What is your view on that issue?
My view is as follows. I thought that the Social Security Trust Fund should be kept separate from the deficit reduction package, voted that way. And the main reason is that the Social Security Trust Fund itself is going to have a whole set of challenging issues to deal with. And the large issue is that by 2030 or thereabouts, the ratio of those who are working to those who retired will be only about 2 to 1. So there are a couple of questions. Number one, if we make the mistake of accepting all these sort of global marketplace arguments that the only way we can compete as a nation is to figure out how to depress wages so that we can compete with Juarez, Mexico, or Seoul, South Korea, or whatever, then we won't have the wage level. Remember, it is the generation that's working that pays into the Social Security Fund for those who retired, and then we hope and pray that when it comes our time, there will be inadequate resources. So it all has to do with jobs and what kinds of jobs. It also has to do with how it's financed. It's a flat tax and fairly regressive, and then Norm, if my memory serves me correctly, there's a cutoff, flat tax up to about the first 60-some thousand dollars. There's really no reason why people shouldn't pay a flat tax on whatever they make, which sort of meets the standard of fairness. And then finally, I think quite clearly we're going to have to look at where retirement age gets set. But if you should say to older people that the retirement age you'd have to, and this is just a question, if you would have to raise the retirement age, the one thing you'd have to do if you did that is you'd have to have absolute guarantee that people would not just put out of work. It can't be, it has to be done in a very consistent way. So I think that clearly some changes have to be made, but what cannot be done is to, quote, means test the Social Security program as a poverty program, as a poor people's program. Poor people's programs become poor programs, and Social Security is one of the best things we ever did in the United States of America. It's universal, it's part of our contract, it's just and it's fair, and we have to continue to finance it and have a very strong Social Security system.
Question: what do you consider to be a livable and fair minimum wage? Do you intend to pursue an increase in the minimum wage during this congressional session?
Absolutely. The bill that I introduced initially, which was pretty similar to Congressman Sabo's, was, I think, went up to about $6.50, and then we indexed it for sort of 50% of average wage or over the years to come. But then I introduced a bill with Ted Kennedy in this Congress that was 50 cents, 50 cents, and 50 cents, which was an attempt to get it up higher than $5.15 an hour. I mean, I think $5.15 an hour is pretty small. I mean, I think it should be much stronger. So what I will push is the bill that Kennedy and I introduced, and the one that Sabo and I introduced I like best of all. So it'll be some accommodation to political reality, but it certainly will be pushing for a higher minimum wage. And yes, I intend to take it all over the state of Minnesota. And one of the arguments that I would like to make is that you cannot have real welfare reform unless you have a commitment to A, family child care, not just for welfare mothers, but for other families as well, and B, a decent minimum wage so people can make a living and support their children.
What exactly is or was the threat of AmeriCorps, the National Service Program, to the conservative agenda? Being unable to join the military, I was looking forward to serving my country and aiding education at the same time. P.S. I love Northfield.
P.S. We do too. This is a real interesting question. The attack on AmeriCorps is, and some of you will know exactly what I'm about to say because you will remember this history, is blatantly ideological. Here's the problem. You have this program. I met with the young people in AmeriCorps in Minnesota at their first gathering. There must have been like 350. It was a rainbow. It was beautiful in terms of diversity, in terms of idealism, in terms of wonderful community work. It's a marriage made in heaven. But here's the problem. The fear is that it'll be like Vista. And these young people will work in these communities, and they will focus on pollution, and they'll focus on problems of homelessness, and they'll focus on problems of hunger, and they'll focus on problems of inadequate housing, and not enough decent jobs, and all of the rest of it. And you know what then will happen? Is they'll start asking the question, why are people homeless, and why are people hungry, and why has this happened to the lakes and the rivers and the streams? And pretty soon they'll be actors in trying to change it all. That's the attack on AmeriCorps. That's right.
Can you say a few words about why so many Democrats these days are afraid publicly to identify themselves as liberals? And then secondly, how did the Republican Party do it? Is there a useful lesson here for the Democratic Party at all levels?
Well, first of all, Corn, on the first part, I think people make a huge mistake when they let others define what liberal means, and then they take the kind of slash and burn definition, and then they run from it. And by the way, I think it's a huge mistake. I spelled out today what I think is a liberal philosophy, which is very much a part of the American dream. And so the point is, you never get anywhere by running or hiding. And I'm not trying to brag at all, and maybe it comes with being 5'5.5", and former wrestler or something, but I don't intend to retreat 1 inch. Don't intend to retreat 1 inch. And the second part is, you bet, there's a lot to learn, and I believe that Democrats had some of what happened to them coming, if I said that correctly. And I think that is not to say that, and I will use with Kathleen here a sort of example of what I think is the tragedy of the shift in balance of power. I will say, and not just because I'm here in Minneapolis, I I have never said anything that I have not been 100% sincere about. Martin Sabo is, I never knew this till I came to Washington, then I could really see it, is the most skillful legislator you could ever imagine. To see him no longer chair the Budget Committee sort of represents the story of what happened and the shame of it all for the moment. Now, after having said that, there was, not by Congressman Sabo, but by all too many Democrats, I think, a certain arrogance. I will tell you right now, I have held off in terms of any public comment about this, but I have never ruled out term limitations. I have never ruled out term limitations. And, I know the negatives and I know the positives, but the reason I have never ruled it out is because I saw firsthand in some of the legislation that I was working on, some of the arrogance of people that have been entrenched in power. I think there was a distance from people. And I also think what happened is that when people don't feel like the Democratic Party is for them, because there is this sort of silence, or because Democrats are unwilling to be clear about what they stand for and what they're willing to fight for, then it leads to a serious decline in participation, which is precisely what happened last election and will continue unless Democrats are clear.
I think this is, again, a follow-up to some degree of the sentiment of those last two questions, and that is, can you explain why the Democrats have not fought back against the religious right? Where is the PR? We are all concerned.
I'm gonna start giving briefer answers because all of a sudden I realize I'm just denying questions, so I apologize if I don't give justice to the different questions. First of all, a counterintuitive answer for you, whether you like it or not. I think you'll like it, but I don't think you'll expect it. The quote religious right, I think that's the way you put it, has those men and women, those women and men have every right to organize, every right to go to caucuses, every right to vote, every right to speak out for what they believe in, and I respect them for working for what they believe in, even if I disagree. And I do disagree with large parts of the agenda. The problem is that large parts of the religious community have been missing in action. And I know I met with some clergy, ministers, priests, and rabbis, and I have just said, where's your voice? Where is your voice? And I do believe that the religious community, have you noticed, is starting to speak up again. And I think it is around the basic justice, fairness questions. But I will just tell you that I think there are large parts of the religious community, the vast majority of the religious community, which has been missing in action, which has been, I fear, kind of sleepwalking through history. And I think now is the time for the religious community to really make an all-out effort to begin to connect within the churches and the synagogues and the mosques and also out into the community. To make this ecumenical, in third century admonition from Rabbi Hill, and some of you or many of you heard it. If I don't speak for myself, who will? If I speak for only myself, who am I? And if not now, when? If not now, when? Might be the most important part of that.
Paul, there were a number of questions about what is the likelihood of the health care and health reform issue coming up again for serious discourse and debate. What's the prospect?
Well, the prospect is not for, if you will, comprehensive reform, and it'll be incremental, and then the question becomes whether the incremental steps are steps forward or great leap backwards, and I'm not sure yet. I mean, I think, for example, introduced a bill last week which is going to be which provides strong protection for both consumers and caregivers vis-a-vis the sort of concentration of the insurance company industry owning and controlling the majority of managed care plans in the country. So the question is, where do the consumers and where do the caregivers fit in? I think that will be important. I think covering at least children and women that are expecting children ought to be an incremental positive step. Trying to give a break to self-employed people so that they can fully deduct or at least partially deduct their medical expenses, as can large companies, I think makes sense. There is consensus, if people were willing to reach into their pockets and back the rhetoric with resources, that home-based health care, as opposed to such a focus on institutionalized care, is the way to go. But I think it's going to be fairly rough sledding, but that doesn't mean that we don't push for it really hard, and we should.
I think we owe Senator Wellstone a rousing ovation for being so forthright in his commentary with us.
I'd like to thank you. Sheila, I would just like to say that, and I'm speaking for both Sheila and I cannot even begin to tell you how much it means to us that you are here today. I cannot even begin to tell you how proud you make me. And I cannot even begin to tell you how determined I am to do well for Minnesota and how determined I am to sort of be involved with all these issues, with all this work within our community and with our country with you. Thank you very much for being here.